Welcome to the Santa Cruz Coffee Break. If you're watching on YouTube or listening on Apple Podcast, please follow, hit the like button, or any subscribes. It really helps us with the algorithms. Santa Cruz Coffee Break is produced by the Santa Cruz Guitar Players Forum. All opinions are those of the speakers. We invite you to join us on the Santa Cruz Guitar Players Forum at SCGCPF for more fun. Now, let's get on with this installment of Santa Cruz Coffee Break.
Good afternoon, folks, and we'd like to welcome you to the 53rd podcast of Santa Cruz Guitar Players Forum. And today we have brought back Will Kahn, and it's not so much to talk about guitars, and guitars are very important, but we're going to talk with Will about his expertise in home recording. We really had a good session with Eric, and we're going to continue those in the future, but we figured we'd get the view from the top from Will. So here we are. It's Thursday the 27th, and Tad's just back from the Woodstock Festival, and looks like it's not as cold. Looks like it's not as cold in Santa Cruz, Will, as it is down here. Is it cold up there?
Pretty warm. I would say low 70s probably.
Wow, we haven't hit 60 in 4 days. In the 30s at night. It's just freezing. There's 2 Great Danes sleeping in front of the fireplace right now, so I'm a pretty lucky guy. But Will's past was in high-end recording, and he'll go over that a little bit. But we hope that what we can give you here is maybe something you can either aspire to, or something that you can maybe pick and choose from and say, okay, I don't want to go all the way with this, but boy, do I want to go all the way with this product. So welcome, Will.
Thank you so much. I mean, I think that one thing I heard in just the intro of Eric Sky's podcast that we just had, which I need to listen to the whole thing, but what a tremendous man and player. And the first thing he talked about was the performance. And
Yes.
I think that in today's age, everybody knows what's possible in the digital world. And, you know, my argument is that when things went digital, it didn't necessarily get better. That if to me, the peak of music, was the late 60s, early 70s. And if you listen to, for me, like two would be Aretha Franklin or Ray Charles. Like listening to that music, there's a whole lot of musicality. It's not the most advanced recording techniques in the history. It's sometimes just a few microphones, and a lot of the Ray Charles stuff, they're in Atlantic Records and they moved all the desks out of the way and they just recorded it there at night, and then in the morning they're moving the desks back. So I think that, what has happened is with the digitization of recording, everything has just gotten so perfect that we've kind of lost the soul and essence of why we're doing it in the first place. You have singers who know that, oh, you can just tune that, or you can loop it, or you can stretch it or move it. And there's the sense of urgency that's lost. So I think that just to solidify what Eric was saying is, yeah, the performance is so important. And it's something that ironically is kind of lost in a lot of studios nowadays.
Do you think there's a future to recording studios? My first job was Hit Factory in New York. And everything associated with that, with Todd's Secret Sound, and at that time it was Power Station, and Record Plant New York, although it wasn't as big as Hit Factory and Power Station were. But we had such well-tuned rooms, and at that time, I think our mic locker had 60 U-47s, and it just crazy stuff. And you really couldn't create at home what we can create now. address that? I mean, do we need it? Do we need ultra fancy rooms or?
Well, I think that, so my first real recording experience was with the group Samba Da that I used to play with here in Santa Cruz. And we went into the big studios and we really weren't ready. There was one called Coast Recording up in San Francisco that we went into that Bill Putnam had built. Great sounding room, wonderful mics, but the band wasn't quite ready. And so what we ended up doing was going in, tracking everyone together, and then bringing it home and starting to pick things apart and overdub one thing at a time. And by the end, it was like, I really loved those records and it was a really great experience. And I do think we need the big studios still. The world has really shifted since the late 70s, the 80s, the 90s when there was big budgets and you had people going in and locking out those big studios. I think now you have to be a lot more careful. There's a lot less money, but I think that because my band wasn't ready, that's when I started getting my home studio together. I thought, how cool would this be? We don't have the pressure. We can invest our money in gear that we can use forever. But there's something about the studio when you just talked about the room. Um, I want to see every studio that's around survive, and I want to see more go up. I think it is really important. There's something about that having a beautiful band together that plays together really well and capture them in a wonderful sounding room with great microphones and a board. There's just something to that. It's just really magic. But I also have a really phenomenal home studio, and I'm doing quite a bit with it. Um, you know, I do think the biggest thing is the performance and the music. And I think that as an engineer, you can lose track of that. And I think that's the biggest thing. It's like play the song. And, I don't recommend recording an album on your phone, but we have all these amazing things around that a really good song and a great performance can translate, in many different ways. Now, I came from the company Burl Audio before I started working here at Santa Cruz Guitars. And I think that what Rich Williams, who's the owner of Burl Audio, he's the Richard Hoover of Burl Audio. He went out to create, once he found kind of this formula of a way to uh, kind of have an analog sound in a digital device. He went all in, and a lot of people tried to talk him out of it because it was just very expensive. The parts can be hard to make, but he didn't care about any of that. He didn't, he knew it was going to be expensive. He knew that not everyone was going to be able to afford it, but he wanted to make something that you could work up to and that was the best it could possibly be.
Mm.
So one big thing to think about in recording is that in the old days you had these beautiful microphones and you also had the tape machine and the recording consoles, and those all together had a sound. And Rich, my old boss, would talk about, with a tape machine, with a really nice tape machine and a really great board, you'd have a band play. You'd tell them, okay, come and listen. You'd hit rewind. They'd sit down on the couch. You'd hit play, and it sounded like a record. And with the digitization, what's gone is things have gotten more perfect. And if you look at a scope, it may be more accurate, but it hasn't gotten more musical. And so what you have now is you have digital recording, which doesn't have those same non-linearities and those same it doesn't sound like a record right away. You have to really kind of figure out ways to digitally manipulate things after the fact. And while that's a blessing and a curse, you get these amazing tools, but again, has music gotten better over the last 40 or 50 years? It's certainly progressed, and there's a lot that I love about it. So with Burl Audio, what they had done was, put transformer on the front end of a digital interface, which means that you have this certain kind of non-linearity happening that is musical and feels good, as opposed to being scientifically perfect. It was like, does it sound good? Oh, this sounds better, then we're going to do this. And not to mention, really built the right way, built in the USA, very heavy duty chassis, all Class A circuitry and high voltage and all stuff. So without going too far into that, what I've found is if you have the certain building blocks, that particular thing, which is the interface, while the performance is the most important part, if you can capture it really well, that interface is actually extremely important part of the whole equation. So I've been incredibly spoiled with that, with the experience of working with Burl.
So how did you test? Did you test? I'm sure you tested with scopes and everything else, but then was there a listening room that you would, it's kind of like,
yeah, absolutely. And that's what the thing is. There was a kid who worked for us and then went to work with one of the local competitors. And he had been soldering different components onto these op amps. And there was one song, I basically was the musician, and the owner would say, okay, we've got this part soldered in today, we're ready to go. And all these parts looked identical on the scope and had the same specs. But when you actually listen to it, some of them I couldn't tell the difference. I couldn't tell what. There was one that I remember, it was a variable we had, and I could turn around and I could tell you based on the guitar, it was in my electric guitar, I could tell you when you switched it and which one it was. It was so, and again, it looks identical on the scope. It's supposedly the same component. So these things were tuned. When you work on a mix, you sometimes put it down and come back the next day and you listen to it in your car. It's something that's kind of living, and you can just kind of get these real minutiae. You have to know when to stop because you can go forever.
a work of art.
It's a work of art, and so
it's never
often,
finished. It's merely abandoned.
yeah, exactly. And so often it was, with a glass of wine in the recording studio, listening to either music coming back, or sometimes we'd record it. And like I said, with this one particular one, I think we did 38 recordings of the same 16 bar song, that I just had the guitar parts and the bass parts and the drum parts all written, and it would just go repeat it. And every change we had to go back and do it again and do it again. And we would, compare it to no interface, meaning the microphone into a mic pre into the speakers, and then we'd start converting, and then we'd hear the different versions of it. So very hands-on in the recording studio. And to finish the story, the young kid who worked with us helping us do that soldering, he worked for another competitor, and he said to the senior engineers, well, you guys have to listen to this, right? And he said they laughed him out of the room, like, oh, don't give me that. So that's something that we really did, is a lot of time in the studio listening to stuff. And it's not necessarily a pitch for Burl. I do think it's the best in the world as far as the interfaces go. Their smallest interface is going to be at $5,500, and you can go up to 20 grand really quickly. So that's the ultimate, I think, that where you want to get to. But as far as home studios go, and I don't know if you want to prompt me on this, but there's a couple factors that I always ask people, how many zeros are you talking about? I could pitch a $1 million studio pretty easily, and then we could talk about building. And I mean, with land prices and all that, I mean, it's infinite, really. But I think that a lot of people like myself are not sitting on $100 million to sink into a recording studio. So I think that one of the first things that would come to mind, if I have a blank canvas, a room in a house, and I have a very limited budget as far as microphones, microphone preamps, and an interface. And a lot of times interfaces have a built-in mic pre. So I'll say the first thing I would do is, we want to look at the performance and the instrument and start with that and listen to how that sounds, because that can inform us for the rest. Now I'm sitting in a room full of sheetrock, with 4 parallel walls. So the second thing I would say is get rid of ugly reflections in a standard room in a house. Something that I would use a lot is I think they call it like a soji screen, if you can correct me, like the Japanese, it's got hinges. and a moving blanket. So if I was going to record in this room right now and get some good volume, you're going to pick up, you're going to hear the kind of fluttering effect of the sound bouncing around. And so you're going to want to get that out to a certain extent. So some soji screens and some moving blankets, is a great way. You can even just hang the blankets any way you want to. Just to, maybe give some space between the wall and the blanket. That'll do a lot for bringing down unwanted reverberations and reflections. But I would also say that, every room has a sound, and there might be some rooms in the house, if we're talking homes, the kitchen might sound really great. I was playing in a recording studio and they have a hall and a bathroom right behind, and I was playing the drums in the main room. And if we open the door, you can hear the reverb of the hallway. That might be really great. So those are the first two things I would say is, focus on the performance and the instrument, and then, some really cheap deadening to kind of eliminate any unwanted, reflections.
I'll completely support that in the packing blankets. I don't know how many times I walked into Sound City, with Petty there, and it was just walls of packing blankets, and it was just whatever they could do to stop those standing waveforms from moving around like that. And it takes 41 feet for a bass guitar note, a low E, to develop. That waveform is 41 feet long.
Yeah, wow.
So it's fascinating, in that you start thinking it in those terms. And you shouldn't, I don't think, as a consumer, you should feel bad if there's a couple packing blankets on your, on your wall. Eric's wife said, just don't make it too weird.
Well, bookshelves are also really great for diffusion, and I guess it's diffusion. It's great for treating a room, so to speak. Records also could be really great.
It's funny you mentioned that, because I have a little warehouse space where I have my shop, and I have a room that I kind of said, okay, guys, this is going to be the band room. And when we first moved into it, it was empty. I mean, and it reverberated something terrible. So we covered the whole thing in moving blankets. That was the cheap thing to do. But over the next few months, I put in walls of bookcases to store all my books. And basically, the room sounded better.
Yeah.
The moving blankets almost blocked too much of the bouncing or whatever, but the bookcases and all the random books actually diffused the bouncing around. I don't know what I'm talking about. All I know is it sounded better.
And I'm with you, and I think that in the
Now,
end, oh, sorry, please go on, Ted.
well, I was going to say, so I will admit my lack of experience with this, and that the only time I have been actively engaged in a professional recording studio was over 50 years ago, when I was in the San Francisco Boys Chorus. And what I remember most about that experience was this large dead room, 40 very preteen boys, trying to get a performance out of them, with, I don't know, we had 3 or 4 mics set up. It was intense. I mean, but to me, the thing I took away from it was the beauty of the studio was it was a workplace. You could be at we rehearsed in the church, and you could go to the church and sit in the back room and rehearse your parts over and over and over and over again. But when you went to the studio, it was a workplace, and you had to know what you were doing. We couldn't afford a huge amount of time, so it was like, okay, now you got to perform, now you got to nail it. And I just remember that environment with the grand pianos and everything. I mean, this is over 50 years ago, so there was no digital, nothing available back then. And to me, that's the one thing. That's why I set up this room in my warehouse. Is I think it's important that you have a space that really is where you go to work. and not just, just a random space and, oh, well, if this doesn't work, I'll try it again tomorrow or whatever else. That would be the one thing I would add to that, environment thing.
Well, it's funny because there was a period where rooms were too dead.
Mhm.
Where they just tried to kill everything about it. And then they kind of went, well, wait a minute, we've gone too far here.
Right.
And we're coming back. And then, I just can't get the picture of Let It Be out of my mind. Here is this amazing sounding room, first of all, but they have a PA set up in there. They are playing a PA at volume, and there's no bleed.
Yeah.
And because they couldn't hear any other way, they didn't have headphones,
Right.
and they're playing in there with. You would never, ever, ever do that unless you were George Martin.
Right. And I think that, one thing that was coming to mind is that, yes, you don't want to go too far. Tad's talking about the sound blankets, the moving blankets rather, being a little too much. And so there's this really great story of Herb Alpert, and they were building some studio, and they were, at some point between starting it and finishing it, and he took a snare drum in the room and hit it once and said, "Everyone stop." And they said, "Well, we're not done yet." And he's, "Yes, you are. That's it." And I think there's a certain character about certain rooms. They talk about When the Levee Breaks by Led Zeppelin, and the house in, northern England they were recording in, and, the stairwell where they put the drums and that, iconic sound. And so I think that realizing that, like, in this room, I can hear it as I'm talking, just, sheetrock parallel walls aren't doing anyone a favor. And so that's something that I think in this room, I would try to really break that up. But you also want to, I think you can play with the natural characteristic of a room, and, maybe have blankets you can put up or down depending on what you're doing. That's just a really cheap way to go. And so something I recommend. And I think the other thing is that sense of urgency that, Tad, you're talking about. And that's something that through the digital, now I've got a hard drive. I can get a 4 terabyte internal hard drive on a computer nowadays. I mean, so how much, you have a
For
tape.
about $69.
Yeah, exactly. And so, if you're on a tape, I want to say it's like 15 minutes of, at 20 let me think about this,
30,
30 ips, I think is about
16 and a half.
There, thank you. So, there's a certain sense of urgency. And what I started to do is, even though I do work digitally, and I do have a little reel-to-reel tape machine that I bought for $75 on Craigslist, by the way, that I use for fun. But there's a certain sense of urgency that comes from the old days of recording to tape, that you didn't have these unlimited, we could just loop record, and like you can literally loop record and get 30 of a certain thing and then go. And I think that the going back to fix it is often a deterioration. And if you can somehow capture, kind of more like, think of it as lightning in a bottle, you want to capture some magic rather than over polish it. I think that's really the best way to go for me anyway. And that's why I've been using the computer as more and more like a tape machine. Just that sense of, I drop markers rather than using my eyes. I remember I had someone come in and we were doing a tape transfer, and I did a digital fade, and I said, "How do you like this fade?" And he closed his eyes and listened, and I looked at him, I thought, why doesn't he want to look? And I went, well, because it's music. I mean, I thought, like, I've been looking at this stuff to determine how it sounds. What a tragedy. So yeah, and then there's just so much, I love to talk about all this recording. I think that another thought that came to me was, you're probably not limited by your stuff as much as you are the room, the performance, and, as an engineer, our knowledge. I have this incredible home studio. I've got an old Yamaha mixing board. I've got an AKG BX20. Richard, do you know what that is?
Yeah.
And I've got this incredible microphone, some really cool microphones. And I've got, the Burl gear to die for and a bunch of, incredible preamps. And so I always say, well, I'm the weak link in my studio, it's not the gear. Although, of course, there's things that I still want. So I think that, really just trusting your ear, listening and trying things. And the other thing is with microphones, the concept of phase between different microphones is so important that for me, so often than not, less is more. And, so I see a lot of people recording the guitars in stereo. And I think that there's a way to do that tremendously. And I generally am doing all my acoustic guitar recordings in one mic that I move around and I find the right spot for it. Because then you don't have potential phase issues between the two mics. And as much as we all want to think that all of everything we record is going to be in like beautiful stereo, often I have a guitar panned to one side anyway. So, Al Schmidt, who I think is just going to be, recognized as one of the best, if not just the best, audio engineer of all time. I mean, one of them to say. And what I couldn't believe him saying is that he's recorded, basically everyone. And he said, I don't use EQ. And I thought, what does he mean? And what he means is that he chooses he has the right room, the right players, the right microphone in the right place. And so he doesn't have to fix it. He knows his microphones, or knew them, rest in peace. He knew that, he was working at Capitol. And so moving a microphone around can be a huge change. So use your ears, use what limited equipment you do have, and less is more.
The key word I'm going to take away from this whole thing is listen.
Yeah.
You're absolutely right. I got to work with Bruce Turgeson a little bit. Wendy, my wife, worked with Al Schmidt a lot. I got to work with some pretty great engineers, and they really opened up my ears. And it's a weird concept, but you really do have to listen. I mean, there's that day, like this guy listening to a playback with his eyes closed. There's a day when the light comes on, and all of a sudden it's like, no, I need to really, really, really listen. The room is critical. I mean, think about Exile on Main Street.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, their amps were downstairs, in coal bins and things like that, for that to work. And that was, I was lucky enough to be part of digital when it came in. And the first thing I know of it was at the Village, and Mitsubishi brought in a 32-track recorder, and we had a bunch of 3Ms, and we ran them simultaneously. And the band was Fleetwood Mac, and they went out in the studio and cut something and came back in, and we were listening to it in the control room, and everybody just looked around and said, this digital thing, it's going nowhere.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that was maybe about 83, might have been 82 or 83. And to put a point of reference to that, Steve Earle's Guitar Town, totally digital.
Mm-hmm.
Which is a great sounding record. And it changed fast. It didn't change as fast in the visual when we went from analog film to digital imaging. It didn't change nearly as fast. And I don't know if that's because of the, everything's in a box of 255. I mean, that's what you've got to work with. And when visuals first came out, our eyes are accustomed to the way a slope of film looks. And I think our ears were accustomed to the way it sounded.
Mm-hmm.
And so people say digital, it's like it doesn't work, oh no. And
Well, let me ask the two of you because I'd be interested in both of your opinions. One of the things I've learned in going to some of these guitar shows is that when you get guitars that are priced over, say, $25,000, they all tend to sound pretty damn good. But there are subtleties, and I'm still learning how to listen to some of those. Now, when you're talking about listening in a recording studio, how do you learn what it is you're listening for? And do you have any recommendations of things for people to listen to train their ears into understanding what they're hearing when they're trying to do recording?
You want to go
Or is
first,
that too
Richard?
deep for a short podcast?
No, I'll take a little whack at it. I was lucky enough to have some mentors that really would take the time, and after a session, we'd go to their apartment and they'd say, "Let me play you this," or when we had downtime, they would say, "Let me play you that." But as Eric said, a great pair of headphones will really open up your ears. And we don't do what we used to do of we don't put on a record and listen to it from the beginning to the end.
Mm.
And I love doing that in the car. I just love putting something on and playing it, and there's no disruption, and unless you rear end somebody, but there's really a chance there for you to hear all these subtleties. And even today, at an advanced age and with kind of funky hearing, I'm still hearing things in some of those records that I never heard before. And it's because I'm listening. And I'm trying to do it non-distracted. We get so many distractions.
Yeah, I mean, I was really lucky to see Quincy Jones speak one time at a South by Southwest, festival, I guess you call it, in Austin. And that was it was like seeing the Dalai Lama or something, And um, he said that that everyone, he was talking about how what he'd worked with Frank Sinatra, and I think he had done, Fly Me to the Moon and all this stuff. And then he got brought on into Michael Jackson's camp. And that there was this whole faction of Michael's management that said, Quincy Jones, you want the big band arranger? Like, what does he know about pop music? And he said, he stopped and he said, I love being underestimated. And then, of course, they went on to do, Off the Wall and Thriller. And then he said, then people have come up to him how do I make a hit record, Quincy? Like he's kind of made I don't know, one of the top selling. There's never be another Thriller, right?
Yeah, it's
And
big. It's a big one.
and so and so he said that Alicia Keys was about to go in the studio again the next couple days, and he was at a party, and her mom was there. And so Alicia's mom says to Quincy, "Hey, Quincy, do you have any advice for Alicia?" And he said, "Just have her play the song she loves." And so in the same way of like training your ear, it's like I think we all know what music we love, what albums have really made a mark in our lives. So for me, if I'm going into a new room, I'll make sure to listen to music I'm familiar with. One of my favorite records of all time is Voodoo by D'Angelo. That was actually done in Electric Lady in New York in the late 90s, I guess, even though it seems much more recent in my brain, and done all the tape. And that's what one thing I'll do is put on a record that I know really well in a new space. And so you kind of get to know it that way. I think it's listening, it's like music, I believe, music is happening all the time, all around us. It's just even right now, it's this like it's kind of like love, which is a force that isn't defined by humans, but we can do our best to describe it or to, with music, I think, and the best music, we're channeling something, not necessarily creating it. I think of it like a garden. You can grow a garden, but how much can you take credit for of a zucchini plant? You didn't make it. It's this miracle, right? Um, So I think that with what to listen to, it's music that you love, because that's what I think we want to make. We don't want to make music we can't stand. I mean, I think as any engineer is going to do, we're going to have to get into maybe a band that we wouldn't listen to, but you still want to do your best work. So as far as what to listen to, Dad, I think music that you love.
Well, yeah, yeah. So yeah, no, that I was going more in the direction of distinctions in the equipment. Like you were talking about flutter in a room.
Okay.
How does somebody recognize something like that? If you're sitting in your kitchen and you've got your, $10,000 DAW and your $500 mic cable and your $50,000 guitar plugged, and you've got everything to the best you can do, and you
Mm.
strum something and it doesn't sound good to you, despite having spent all that money, how do you listen to that? How do you try and determine where that's coming from? Is it an environmental thing? Is it reflection? Is it that you don't have something plugged in right? Is it that you have the EQ wrong? Is it that you have I'm wondering if there's ways that people can learn how to listen to get the best out of what they have.
I mean,
Um,
the first thing I would say is like if we have a variable, we're talking flutter, for example, or I don't know if that's the right word, but if we're talking about the reverberation, then we know that theoretically hanging blankets will deaden that. So I
mhm.
would say, record it one way, then change one variable at a time. You know, I would start with no EQ. Start with putting the EQ at nothing, putting a microphone up and playing, and then listen and really, and I think that as you start to, anyone who's recording, a few hundred hours, even just a beginner, will start to kind of know, where you want it to go. And I think then if you then try a different microphone, then listen to that, so it's an ongoing process. And I think that there's a balance between I remember, I think it was Tom Waits was producing something, and there was an engineer and he was like halfway set up and the band came in and started playing, and Tom looks over the guy and says hit record, and the guy says, oh, but the mics aren't all set up in the right place, and he just says hit record right now. That there's, you don't want to get into a thing where you're never, that you don't actually get anything done because you're experimenting the whole time. But I think, you have to get into the joy of moving that microphone, changing the microphone, doing one thing at a time. And then you can listen to the two and say, okay, I like that, sounds better to me, you know?
So what I hear you saying is it's just like learning how to play guitar. It takes a whole lot of practice and a whole lot of paying attention, which is
Could be.
probably one of the reasons that professional recording studios will stick around for a very long time. Because I know an awful lot of musicians who don't have that patience. They'll spend lots of time working on their song, working on their instrument, working on their technique, so that they get what they hear, what they want to hear. But when they sit down to record, yeah, they're not going to take that kind of time. So,
And I would suggest too, if I have a home studio and I want to just be recording, you can even think about hiring someone to come in specifically saying, I want help getting my studio set up. You're going to be $300 for the day, $500 for the day. I'm going to pay you. I want you to come and help me get set up. Because what I was doing during the pandemic, I got my studio kind of all put together, and I set microphones up. I did 5 microphones on the drums. I did a kick mic, a snare mic, 2 overheads, sometimes one, and then kind of I called it a trash mic. It was a really old, just sounds really terrible, but kind of the room just blended in. I distort it and send it to tape, and it sounded great. I had my guitars ready, my bass ready, and my Fender Rhodes plugged in. And what that meant is I could just go in there and hit record and maybe move a couple things around, but I had it all set up. So having someone come in and help you, if you're a type of musician that just wants to record, you don't want to spend all that time, bring someone and spend a little money hiring someone in freelance for a day or two, and that'll get you, a, get you a lot, I think.
yeah.
I think the whole name of the game is doing as much as you can with as little as you have, and don't blame your equipment for not making great music. You can
Right.
always spend more. There's, vintage microphones. If I had I could do $1 million in about 5 minutes if you said, okay, go. I could spend it. But I don't have all that, and there is a lot of there's a lot you can do digitally nowadays, all the plugins that are emulating all the old
Mhm.
analog gear. I love the old analog gear, and if I could have it all, I would, but I don't have the space, I don't have the budget. So I think that just to say in closing on that point, do as much as you can with what you have and focus on
Right.
the music. Throw up a microphone in front of the guitar and play the hell out of that guitar rather than think about how your mic placement might be off. If you play
Right.
poorly, it's not going to sound good through whatever
Yeah.
microphone, wherever it is.
Think about Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young first record. Those guitars were recorded with an SM57.
Yeah.
You know, I would recommend finding something that you really love and seeing who engineered it
Yeah.
and seeing what else they've engineered.
Yeah.
And even if you're getting out of music that you're comfortable with or something like that, see what they did.
Yeah.
See how they approached the situation. A great engineer really is probably as important. And find a guy like Eric who's
Yeah.
who's willing to help you be a mentor. You
There
know,
are,
there
there
are
are, yeah. I was just gonna say, I mean, I have ran into a few, very, very few people who seem to be really guarded about their secrets about what they did on the mix. Most everyone I've found is very accomplished and incredibly, an open book and very graceful about sharing knowledge. Um, I
Well,
wonder if we
it's
should
like Richard. It's like Richard in building guitars. He can
totally,
tell you every secret he's learned over 50 years of building guitars. You aren't necessarily going to be able to build a guitar as well as he does.
yeah, exactly, exactly. So, I wonder if there's like maybe, I wonder if I'm trying to think if there's like specific questions a guitar player might have about, how to get the best sound out of a guitar.
Well, I think that it would be fun to talk a little bit more about the other equipment that's involved. I mean,
Sure.
so let's say you have a SM57 or an SM58, a basic brand name, inexpensive microphone. If you don't have a tape recorder to plug that into, you need to go another route. So interfaces. It's amazing what's out there in terms of interfaces right now. And as I understand it, which again may not be entirely accurate, an interface is just a way to convert the analog signal coming from the microphone into a digital signal that you can put into your computer or whatever else. And some of them, I was always thinking that you had to get the fanciest one you had, Thunderbolt 2 or whatever else. But I've read some, or I've actually watched some YouTube videos where people were explaining that the bandwidth on basic USB that every single device has is more than enough for the amount of data that an interface is putting out. Is that true? I mean, can we get away with a very simple interface and get a decent sound?
Well, I think that's two different things. So talking about bandwidth of the digital side is one thing, but then when you're talking about the
Okay.
interface, that's a whole nother discussion. So I would say, because we were moving a lot more data and doing, larger interfaces, we'd be doing, so like for example, 48 to 64 channels of real high quality audio. I wouldn't do that over USB myself. I mean, there's now
No, no.
USB-C, which I think is the Thunderbolt 3. For some reason, I've heard the Thunderbolt 3 be spec'd out more than the USB-C, even though it's the same connector. So I think that that's one thing is it depends on what you're doing. Most interfaces are using, off the shelf components and, you know, really very basic analog circuitry. Very, very, very basic. And, basic is fine. I think, once now that I'm working for Richard Hoover, unfortunately, he's kind of ruined guitars for me, meaning I'm never going to look at guitars again the same way. I'll never look at a Sunburst the same way. And he never told me, oh, this is a good Sunburst. I love Richard's attitude that there's no such thing as a bad guitar because a $50 guitar could change the world. And I love that he's gracious about it. And we all know that he wants to make at every single potential variable in a guitar, make that guitar the best it can be. So again, I'm really spoiled in the same way I am with Santa Cruz guitars I was at Burl Audio. So to me, there's people that I've talked to at a really, really high level who said, there was an amazing engineer or a producer down in Miami, and he said, when all these new interfaces came out and I was listening, I just thought that unfortunately, like no one was going to ever hear what I used to hear when we'd have a tape machine in the studio. And then with the Burl products, I felt it again. I felt that sound and I thought it was gone, and it's here again. And so again, I mean, I know I'm just waving that flag, but it's truly what I think even now after not working for the company. This is what I would have said working for the company as a sales
Mhm.
pitch, but I've no professional affiliation with them anymore, but it's what I use all the time. So I think that an interface, there's so much that can go on in an interface, and most people are kind of the, well, it doesn't matter, it's good enough. And if you do things like Richard does with the guitars, that doesn't exist. You're
Right.
not going to put plywood in a certain part of the guitar that people just don't see because it's good enough. We're going to use Sitka or, well, you know what I mean? It's like everything is thought out. So most interfaces, I would argue, are not made like Burl does, where we sit with a glass of wine and would tune it like over and over and over, get the most, the best musical sound. So I don't think it really has to do with I think the analog and the magic really happens in the conversion happens in the analog side of things. Let me back up. The sound of the device, if you don't do the analog right, it's going to be, it doesn't matter how good the digital side is. And so, for example, if you have a really underwhelming kind of sterile analog section, then it doesn't matter how the USB is transferring it. It's bringing it from the analog through that circuitry, then to the digital, and then from that point, it's ones and zeros. So as long as you're not getting errors, you're fine. As long as you're not getting dropout or some type of like buffer issue, then that USB is fine. It's really like with what I know about interfaces, it's how the signal, it's the analog section that really makes them unique.
So it sounds like you'd recommend somebody invest a reasonable amount of money in a good interface. You can always change out the mics, but you don't want to be changing out interfaces.
It's really true. I mean, I think like when we say with Santa Cruz that, you're coming to Santa Cruz to buy a lifelong guitar, not that something that you think you work up to it, because it's done all the way. It's no compromise. It's really built to be someone's last guitar. They may get another Santa Cruz
Right.
guitar. They may decide later they want a different guitar, but it's not the case where it's, a step to anywhere else. And, for me, the interface in a recording studio or home studio, it's a hugely important part of the situation. So I would say, I'd much rather use a 57 and a really good interface than a really good mic through a really poor interface.
Perfect. That's,
That's
yeah, okay. That makes a lot of sense. That makes a lot of sense.
that's really valuable. That's
Yeah,
really, really, really valuable. That's a huge takeaway from today.
yeah.
And it just amazes me as I'm sitting here thinking, listening to you. I had never really considered how important that analog conversion. I mean, yeah, I get it, but I'd never really thought about it in depth that we could really get that.
Well, and I think that, when things went digital, I mean, it was, the consumerism, globalism that, there's not a lot of I had a friend at this other company that they are, I mean, I can only imagine making $100 million a year in the sales of these things. And I called him one day, we were going to do an A/B test. And I said, how do you calibrate this thing? And he said, you don't. And I said, well, what do you mean? And he said, oh, it's a 30-cent op amp. And I went, oh, okay. And that it's good enough for most everybody. And it's the thing has been that, and there's so much marketing out there, right? There's so much marketing about, oh, this is, perfect. This is the transparent converter. This just gives you what you put into it. Everyone's pitching that they have the most transparent converter, yet they all sound different. So how is that? And so there's something that really, happens that's not flattering in conversion. And
Mhm.
so, then there's different ways you can address that. And, I think that I thought maybe after, 6 months of not being at Burl, I'd maybe be open to other interfaces. But for me, I'm just being totally candid that I'm just really so stuck on that because there's a certain sound that I know I can get with that um, that just comes so quick and natural. Like in the old tape days, it just sounded good right away. And if you can do that, then you're ahead of the game. And in the same breath,
Yeah,
I would never say I couldn't make a great recording because I didn't have a certain thing. I just know it's going to be better if I use, that interface.
that in some ways you're preaching to the choir because that's how I feel about my Santa Cruz guitars.
Yeah.
I'm sure I could pick up another guitar and sound as good as I could probably sound, but I always feel like I sound better when I'm playing a Santa Cruz. So
Yeah.
that's easy. I understand that.
Yeah. I
But
think
let
we
let
just,
me ask you this
yeah, go
about
on,
interfaces.
please.
What would you consider to be two or three of the most important things for somebody to look for in an interface? Obviously, the analog to digital conversion is something that somebody would, I assume, have to listen for. I don't know if there's any specs or numbers or models or something that they could see that the device includes that would mean something to them. But are there other features in a interface that you think are important to look at?
I
Um,
mean, they all kind of come right away. The first things that come to me are going to be functionality. Do you need a monitor control inside that you can, do you have, you can, of course, break everything out. You can have microphone pre's, the preamps outside of an interface, or you can have it included. So it really comes down to what kind of functions do you need, if you need the microphone preamp. So really, truly, an interface really refers to having generally microphone preamp and control room monitor. So you can basically connect it to your computer, plug a microphone in, and plug your headphones or speakers in, and it's all encompassing. We talked about converters, analog to digital and digital to analog converters being, without mic pre or control room. So you have to connect those to other pieces to utilize. So often when people talk about an interface, they want an all-in-one box where you plug the microphone in and you connect your speakers and you can record. So I think features is an important point. You know, the That's a really good question because I think it's going to come to channel count. How many do you need? I always recommend, I'd rather have fewer channels of excellent than more channels of crap, is what I say a lot. But I would say channel count, there's just the basic features of what is it that you're looking for. Do you have money for external microphone preamps? Maybe not. So you need those to come from your interface. Your channel count, the monitoring, do you have headphones? You have two sets of headphones, so you can have someone else on headphones while you are sharing headphones. There's workarounds and everything. Um, Sample rate, are you able to, I always recommend recording at 96K sample rate. That's 96,000 samples per second. Um,
that's a lot
most
of
interfaces,
samples.
yeah, most interfaces now are going to do that. The other things would be, the things that are Burl specific, which is going to be Class A circuitry, 24 volts of, power, discrete signal path, no integrated circuits, but that's really specific to Burl. there's a couple other companies actually haven't said that. So signal path would be another thing to look at, but nothing's going to be cheap when you're really getting the best Class A discrete, analog signal path.
Okay, okay. So I guess, I mean, when I was looking at them, the things that I always thought was really useful was 48 volts of phantom power. It always surprises me that some of them have different amounts of voltage. Of course, I've never understood why different
I'm
microphones require
guessing,
different amounts.
well, so condenser microphones need that power to function. And so I can only guess that if you're looking at something other than 48 volts, I can imagine if you're putting it onto a scope and you'd see it, maybe it's 47.8 or something, but I think everyone's going to call phantom power 48 volts, and anything else you're seeing would be a reference of some other type of voltage. Richard, do you have any thoughts on that one?
I'm just thinking about a pedal board, just
Oh,
an
cool.
example of a pedal board where
Yeah.
the 18-volt supplies sound
Yeah.
better. They just sound better than the 9-volt supplies. A pedal that's designed around 18 volts just sounds better. It just sounds cleaner and things. No, other than that.
And that's one of the things with the
Okay.
Burl stuff, not to, keep going on this, but it's a 24-volt rails. And that's with the Class A circuitry. It's something really, really beautiful. And now that I've heard it, it's like the same thing with the guitars. I'm just spoiled. So, Tad, I'm guessing that if it says something other than 40, and I think that anyone who's advertising phantom power is always going to say 48. I don't think there's anyone who's
Okay.
going to, offer a 52-volt phantom power. I think it's 48 is the standard.
Well,
And yeah.
oh yeah, yeah, yeah. No, I just know that there were some of those internal guitar mics and various other things that are like on 10 volt or other weird voltages, and I didn't know if that really mattered. But that's okay. So the next step in the chain would be going into your computer. And that is where you get into recording software. And I know that there's some big brand names. Logic is what you hear a lot about, or I think it's what Avid
Avid has
is
Pro
maybe
Tools, which
another
is it.
one.
Yep. Yep.
Yeah, and then there's people like me who are pretty damn happy with GarageBand, especially since it's free.
Right.
And then there are also some other free DAWs or digital audio. I don't know
Work,
if it's workstations or
Mhm.
workplaces or
workstations.
Workstation. Yep.
okay. And there's a number of them that are available on that. I know I tried playing with one on my iPad that it worked, but it was a little too difficult to try and run a recording studio on my iPad when I didn't really know what I was doing. Do you have any feedback or thoughts on those?
Well, I think that, whatever works is kind of my initial reaction. I don't really know Logic. Of course, I hear about it a lot. I grew up teaching myself Pro Tools in the
Pro
recording
Tools,
studio.
that's the
But
other
Pro
one.
Tools is now owned by Avid. DigiDesign was a company up in the Bay Area that developed it long ago. Um, so Pro Tools is a major industry standard in the US. Although if you get to Europe, you see a lot of Cubase, Nuendo, and Logic over there. So Logic is an Apple. It's kind of garage band on steroids. Um, I have always just really had the most frustrating time working in GarageBand because I don't know it, and I think that they've dumbed it down so that Logic has features that you don't have in GarageBand. Um, so because I know Pro Tools so well, that's how I can work really fast, and if I think I need to do something, I can kind of quickly do it. Um, and then lately, I've been working in Ableton Live, which is a really interesting program that kind of thinks about things in a very different way. It thinks about it. There's kind of two different views you can think about it. Like you can look at it as Pro Tools, where you have or GarageBand, where you have linear, you record here and it goes like this. But it also can get in this whole other thing where you can sequence different clips of music and arrange stuff in a totally different way. And I have a little controller at home. So I'm doing this thing where I've kind of got all this loop-based music I'm making, but then at the same time, I can spit it out on my analog console and kind of mix as I go. So that's just, I think that it comes down to whatever you're comfortable with, if it works for you, then go for it. It's so tempting to want to get a manual out and start watching videos and look at all the things you can do with the program. Even GarageBand, I'm sure there's a lot of things you can do. But what I kind of try to do is say, okay, what's my goal musically? How can I make that happen? Not, how am I going to look at every single thing that can be done? We had these, I was working down at East West, which used to be Cello, which used to be United Recording before that, a Bill Putnam room down in Hollywood. And the engineer assistants were saying, I was like waking up at 4 a.m. and I was thinking about, how could I do this? And what if I did this? Like they're thinking about Pro Tools and how to do all the different amazing things. So it really comes down to what works for you and what is your goal. If you want to make really loop-based music, maybe GarageBand isn't the best one. Maybe you find it's just absolutely fine for what you're doing. GarageBand is something that's so accessible. I can't stand it because it doesn't do what I want it to do when I want it to do it, but that may be user error. And if it works for you, then do it. That's my.
So I'm always scared of things like Logic or Pro Tools or Cubase or whatever, because I keep getting these advertisements for add-ins, the all these extra goodies that they want to try and sell you to do things that I don't understand. And they don't just want to sell them to you, they want to rent them to you.
Hate that. No, I mean, you can buy, at least you could buy a Pro Tool, anyone could want to sell you more stuff. So I mean, I'm good at filtering out unwanted emails. There is a whole subscription thing that's huge nowadays. Netflix really was onto something, I think. So, I don't want a subscription. Adobe wants you to have a subscription if you want to have Photoshop now. And so there, again, like I use Pro Tools in the way that I want to use it. And I don't do edits visually anymore. I used to look at the waveform and find it and click there. What I do now is I play it and I tap on the marker on the keyboard to drop a marker, the enter key, and it puts a marker there, and I'll wait till the next one and I'll hit that and I can select from the first one and the second one and get rid of it. And so I'm editing by ear using Pro Tools. There is, I think, a Pro Tools one you can buy outright. The problem is when they start upgrading, if you're on a subscription, they'll upgrade you for free. But I think with Logic too, I think you can buy Logic with a computer. I don't think Logic, I think if you investigate, there are ways you can use the software you want and not have to do a subscription for now. Knock on wood.
Okay. Knock on wood, yes.
And Universal Audio is a company here in town. They do plugins. They do really some of the best digital emulations, I think. And they're always selling something new, but that doesn't, you don't need it. And I think if you're not tempted to, if you're in the home studio business, if you're into building a home studio, you're never going to finish. You're never going to, you could say all you want. Oh, I've got everything I need now. Yeah, right. You're going to find something. And I think doing what you can with, making the most out of what you have is a great way to go. I wouldn't worry about all the subscriptions. If you want a subscription, that's fine. I would find something that's not subscription based. Get the program. Don't worry about all the other things you don't need. Go get what you need when you know that you need it and you've exhausted all the options. They have stock plugins in Pro Tools. You can use those with great effect. It's not the coolest thing, but it's actually, I think, wonderful to have limitations. That's one thing I'll say. With digital, we have no limitations. We can do 164 tracks. That's a random number, but we can just go unlimited number of tracks and you can just revise everything to death. But having the limitation of just a few channels is actually not a bad thing.
Well, and to me, in my mind, and again, this is just from my perspective. I look at it like an electric guitar and an amp. Here you've got this nice electric guitar. It's got, a couple of tone controls, couple of volume controls. You plug it into an amp, and the amp has got, some EQ settings and some reverb settings and whatever else. And then somebody comes along and starts saying, well, now you need to buy these 32 pedals and have this whole pedal board all set up with all these different effects all tied into each other. And to me, that's how it sometimes feels like with some of these recording studio software is here you've got this great signal coming in and you've got this program that can do all these things, but now we're going to start selling you all these other add-ins that you need to have in order to do something with it. It gets very confusing to me. Again,
Well, I think,
I will say it again. This is where professional studios and professional engineers are never going to be put out of business, because to understand all that and to get the best out of it.
And it reminds me of being, in Latin America, and you have someone standing at a a stoplight, and they come over to wash your windshield, and you just have to say, no, gracias, estoy bien, like, no, thank you. And I think with, you could never stop going, and that's why I say, how many zeros do you want to spend? So I think let's not forget there's a goal here of home recording, right? We want to have a home studio. Why? Because we want to record our music. So everything that's not helping you do that, forget about it. Like, block it out, because there's so many things. There's our bills, we have kids, sometimes there's work, we got to do all these things. You have to fight for that time to get in the studio and make it happen. And so really think of that as sacred, and you want to be able to hit, put that mic down, hit record, and then channel something meaningful. And so you can, as an engineer, as a home studio owner, you don't worry about there's going to be a million things you don't know, I guarantee you, and a bunch of things we don't understand. But think about listening to what's coming out of those speakers, and you're going to always think, how can I make that better? And when you find a tool that will help you make that better, then you can look at getting it. Otherwise, don't buy anything until you maximize that mic and that interface and those speakers. Your room, you can get those moving blankets, move them around a little bit, maybe go into the kitchen and try it in there. There's so many variables we have with our limited, resources, that you could easily get into a subscription paying $100 a month for the newest plugins. But if you don't even know how to use them, then it's probably not making it sound any better.
Right. Well, and now you're talking about speakers, and that's kind of where we're at, after you've got this thing in your DAW. Speakers. You have stereo speakers, which, all of us are used to. Then they make specialized speakers that they call monitors, which, I guess are some specialized form of stereo speaker. And then you have headphones, or nowadays, plastic things you shove in your ears.
Right.
What are your thoughts about all these, and which ones? I mean, what do you recommend people do to evaluate what they've recorded?
I'm going to jump in right there. JBL 4311s. Get a pair. Get a pair of Aratones, which used to be the biggest. They're 5 inches square, and they're on every recording studio console in the planet.
Let me make a plug for a friend here, which he's made during the pandemic. He made a company. They're basically making hand-built wooden mix cubes, we call them.
Great.
And it's a company called G-Tone. Well, the company is called Phantom Center, which refers to when you have two speakers and you can hear something that sounds like it's in the middle because it's coming out of both speakers equally, and then you can pan things around. So the Phantom Center is like when you have perfect balance there, you can hear something that sounds like it's in the middle. So Phantom Center has a gorgeous hand-built, you can get one or two, the G-Tone. So that's the Oratone, just made out of beautiful walnut. Incredible. Check those out. So you're totally right. The mid-range little speaker. I was just listening last night through those speakers, the Quincy Jones record Roots.
Yeah.
and it was just incredible. And I thought for a second I had my other speakers on because it just sounded so sweet. So anyway, it's just funny that we talk about this. So that's a really great recommendation. I'll turn it back over to you.
Yeah, our tones. I have the set of NS10 Yamahas that was in Studio C at Record Plant. When they closed, I bought those speakers. And I can't imagine the amount of records that have been mixed on those things. But everybody listened on our tones as well, just because they're not sure. The hardest thing, to me, the weak link in video, in audio, is putting it in the world. You take something and you put it in the world, and the person listening to it might be listening to it on the greatest stereo system in the world, or it might be a boombox from 1980.
Yeah.
It's hard to say what they're listening to it on. So you got to make the best possible recording you can for yourself, and try to reference it against the world. Did you guys have cassette tapes? When
you guys?
At the end of the night, did you take home cassette tapes to listen to? You said you were taking home mixes and stuff. I mean, we made so many cassettes for people.
No.
And Hit Factory was a big deal because we made great sounding cassettes.
Right.
We got work because of these. They would take these pieces of plastic home with them, and every night, every night the Eagles took everything home with them.
Right.
And listen to it in their car or wherever they listen to it,
So Tad, what the NS10 and the Oratone or G-Tone, they're designed to be extremely, like layman's, just like they're not hi-fi speakers by any means. I think the NS10 sound pretty bad, but the point is they're known, they're everywhere because they're not trying to make it sound huge. It's like a reality check. It's like, okay, what's this going to sound when we take it out? And there was a Kendrick Lamar is a really famous rapper, and his engineer Ali, they were using some of our gear, and I was in there. It was a big, exciting session. And the first thing he did after he's finished the mix on the big SSL board is put it on an iPad and listen to how it sounds. And so, a lot of I could go into, $15,000 speakers. I think ATCs are really, really wonderful. If you have 15 to 30 grand, we could talk about that. But I think a big part is, your car. That's another place that people go right away is to their car.
Right.
To listen to how does it sound in the real world, right? And I have
Yeah.
a
Well, that was what
Highlander. I've got a 2017 Highlander that they were the bass is like ridiculous. It's like really, really bumped really low. And then if I have a really nice sounding bass guitar, I can hardly hear it. So I think in the future I'll have a new car because that's just not going to work. But I think
well,
the
that's
NS10
what
is a
I
great
had
one.
heard
Yeah.
is that that's what I'd heard is that the engineers used to mix things so that it would sound really good in the AM radio of a 64 Plymouth Belvedere. That was how they mixed things.
Yeah. So it's like, where is it going? Unfortunately today, so like, in a lot of the hip hop music, you have a really, really loud bass, right? So if I put that in my car, there's no problem. But what they're doing is they're adding distortion to bring the low end up into the mid range so you can hear it on a phone or on your earbuds, because they know that that's where a lot of the listeners are going to be. So, I guess you have to decide, what is your audience? Are you you want to put this on YouTube? Are you making an album? Are you sending out demos? You have to think about, I think it's good to have a nice pair of studio monitors. And when you get them, you need to really listen to them and listen to music that you love again. That's where I was talking about, to understand how it sounds, the room and the speakers, because that's going to give you like an understanding of what's coming back to you when you play guitar or whatever you're recording.
Yeah, I think that's where Eric was talking about having reference tracks, things that you know what they sound like, what you'd like to hear about them, and make sure that whatever you're listening to, it gives you a frame of reference so
You
that
know,
you
and
have a better understanding of what you're hearing.
you know, it's like in a lot of times I was talking about earlier with guitar players having two mics on the guitar. I mean, it's a great way to go. I'm not saying don't do it, but you have to know that you're having a potential for phase issues, right? So you're not really going to catch that kind of stuff unless you are mixing and you know understand how everything needs to sit in place. And one thing I told Richard when I first started working here is that I do a low cut on every acoustic guitar I record. Why? Because I have a bass drum and I have a bass guitar. And so the vocals I'm pulling, you know, so sometimes if I'm recording my guitar, I might want to hear myself play a dreadnought that's just got all this beautiful, you know, advanced X bracing and have a really nice solid low end. But when I put that into a mix, that may not be what I want. And so I would just again encourage anyone who wants to get into home recording, who are your, you know, recording heroes? Like I'm saying, what albums do you really love? Who recorded it? And I would suggest that nowadays, finding out who like your most famous engineer, you know, they're they're going to conventions, they're talking to people, they're answering questions. They're so I mean, there I found a few real closed kind of jerks, but hardly any. I mean, everyone just seems so happy to share. And if you let someone know that you're an admirer of their work, I mean, generally it's like they'll just tell you anything. You know, there's a wonderful
Yeah.
man down in Miami who recorded all the Amy Winehouse stuff, Gary Noble. Wonderful gentleman. He's from originally from Jamaica, and he did a bunch of 90s hip hop stuff, the Fugees and all the stuff. I mean, he couldn't be a nicer man. And he's just he'll tell you what he did for Amy Winehouse's vocals. I use this mic and I put it through that compressor. You know, that I guess my last little rant here is that if you know what we may want out of our acoustic guitar, for example, I'm using that as an example, may not be what they want to end up using if they're actually mixing. So it's like, what's the end result and what's the goal? And then contact people who are doing work that you really admire. And most of the time, you'd be really surprised that they're an open book and will say, oh, you know what? I'd recommend you. I'm listening to this. Move your mic back 6 inches, you know, something like this, you know, just to help out. So really ask for help. I think it's all around, and people love talking about this stuff, as we certainly do.
Cool. Yeah. All right. Well, I think we got to be careful or we're going to run this thing all afternoon.
I would.
Yeah.
I'm happy to.
It really is. You've really hit some really great points. You know that listening and people are willing to help.
Yeah.
You know, there's no magic pill for it. I mean, you know, if you set a budget, and that's a pretty important point in what we're talking about, is you set a budget and you try to take a look at that and say, okay, where can I spend the money? You know, and what's really important to me? Where am I going to do it? But then it just comes down to just performance and doing the hard work. You know, it yeah, it's just listening and doing the hard work. Really, it is hard work.
Yeah.
Henley had
I,
Henley had 50 snare drums for the long run.
yeah.
And I think it was 4 days that we're in the studio just listening to this, you know, and you can lose your mind really fast, you know,
Yeah.
or you can just, you know, do the work.
Well, I think what we should say is that this is a discussion that's worth continuing, and perhaps we should have a section on the forum that is geared more towards helping people understand how and what and with what um, they can get some help with their recording, their technique, their style, their technology, their whatever else is going to be involved.
It's a it's a real opening,
I
eye
think
opening.
it's,
Yeah,
yeah.
it's huge. We do have a section. We do have a piece on the forum called recording, and it might have 5
Yeah.
posts in it. You know, it's got nothing in it, and we put
Right.
it there. We put it there for a reason. You know, we put it there for exactly what Tad's talking about, is that it might be an open forum where people could come in and share. And, you know, that's a hard part of it is everybody's
Yeah.
embarrassed, or nobody wants to go out and say, I don't know.
Right.
But that's when you learn.
That is totally
You
liberating.
know, when you say, I don't know, and you humble yourself to that person in front of you, then you learn, you know.
And
Yeah.
certainly I would say if, Richard, I mean, with your past, I mean, I would be asking you a lot of questions. So I don't want to come across as an expert when I'm not. But I'll say that if anyone did have any questions for me that goes on the forum, I'm happy to, answer those.
Perfect.
And I
Appreciate
would
that.
love to do it again. This is so much fun.
We'll come back.
Yeah.
So you know,
I wanted to just say one quick thing on the speakers we talked about, just to wrap this little tidbit in there. I'm a big fan of no digital signal processing inside of a speaker, which really limits the number of speakers. So I mentioned ATC. I'm a fan of the focals, and I use the Amphions. So those are no digital signal, no conversion and correction. It's just an old school analog speaker, and pretty much everyone else is doing you have a converter inside the speaker and it's correcting for certain things, and you can
Okay.
run programs. So I'm a big fan of that. As I mentioned, ATC, Focal, Amphion. Those are ones
Okay.
that I'm.
I
you,
need to ask a question then.
yeah, you opened a door
I
there.
thought that speakers, yeah, I thought that speakers just took a signal coming out of an amp or something and run it through a crossover so that you didn't drive high frequencies to your woofer and low frequencies to your tweeter, but that's all they did. Now, are you telling me there's something different going on in speakers these days? Are they actually
Yeah,
putting active circuitry inside them in some ways?
yeah, they are, and they're
Uh,
doing corrective stuff. But we can get into all that. But I'll just say that the ones that I mentioned
All
are
right, we
not.
got
I'm
yeah, we
good.
got a whole nother podcast
Yeah,
here,
Yeah,
man.
I,
I got to
yeah.
learn a little bit more about this because
I got I got to
I
ask
didn't know any of that stuff was happening.
I got to ask a Will question on this. So, what are you using for power amps?
I actually have, I'm using what I have available. So I have a power amp for my speakers with the Amphion set that I have.
Yeah, yeah.
I have an Amphion amp
Okay.
as well
Yeah.
that matches. And then, because I'm a big fan of like not wasting stuff, the little G-tones, those little, I'll have to send you a picture. They're just gorgeous. Um, my the band leader from the Brazilian band Papiba had this old Yamaha amp from like the late 80s or early 90s that was sitting in a shed and didn't work, and he gave it to me and I had it fixed up, and that's what I used to power those things. And my friend Danny Munoz, who's I can't remember where he's from in South America, but he's the one who created these things. Colombia. He's from Colombia, and his family had a sound company. And he said, "Oh, we used to use the like Yamaha was a big importer into Colombia." And he said we used to have those amps like everywhere, and so he really knows the amp really well. And it's a little noisy. It's got a little fan in it, but that's what I'm using for the power amps. Yeah,
Yeah.
the
I
Amphion for the Amphions, and then an old Yamaha.
I was thinking, I remember we had Crown D60s for the Aratones.
Mhm.
Pretty much that was a standard, and no matter whatever studio you went in, it was a Crown,
Yeah.
and it was a D60, and that powered just the Aratones and the speaker selector and all that stuff. But
Up at Burl's headquarters, the owner's got like he's got these incredible PMC speakers. There's just like massive things, and they've got 3 amps for each speaker, which are all Bryston. It's like these, yeah. I mean, it's just like this rack of like
All
you
right.
could not lift up that rack. It's like gorgeous. So that's a really good way to go. But again, I'm making do with what I can get, um, and happy to do it.
One of these days, I'll tell you about my custom Bozak concert grands I had when I was a young man. But yeah, that'll be a whole nother discussion.
Love
So
it.
it sounds like we're going to have to really liven up the recording section of the forum, throw
Yep.
some pictures up there of all this stuff we're talking about, some links, and maybe even some sound samples. Um, and since I don't know what the hell I'm doing, I'm going to let the two of you kind of take charge on that.
Sure.
And we'll see what we can get up there on the forum. And for everybody who's made it this far in this podcast, let's just remind you that the Santa Cruz Guitar Players Forum is where all the letters and numbers get typed out so that you can learn about this stuff and find the links. And we hope that you will subscribe and join and participate, because that's where we do it.
Thank you, Will.
Oh, what a pleasure, guys. Thanks so much.
Really appreciate it. Thanks very much. Have a wonderful afternoon, you guys.
You too. Thanks so much.
Yes. Thank you.
Be well.
We hope you enjoyed this installment of the Santa Cruz Coffee Break. For more music-related fun, please join the Santa Cruz Guitar Players Forum at SCGCPF or santacruzguitarplayers.com. If you have any questions or possible podcast topics, please contact us. If you have a product or service that you feel would be of value to our listeners, please consider adding your support and keeping the coffee pot on. Contact us for more information. We ask that you hit the like, follow, bell, or bookmark buttons so we can keep you informed of upcoming podcast episodes. We hope you enjoyed Santa Cruz Coffee Break. Now it's time to go play your guitar.